Dus violent media effect Psychologie?
Is there an effect of violent video games and media on psychology? To begin with, by the age of 18, US children were estimated to have witnessed 200,000 acts of violence and 8,000 murders on TV, according to Houston 1992. Crenshaw and Murdoch in 2005 estimated that this number has risen to 40,000 murders. Important questions to ask include, does the media have an effect on psychology? What are the psychological mechanisms that are being affected? And is there possibility for remediation or intervention? There was a famous court case against the video game industry, and this was brought about by Arnold Schwarzenegger and Edmund Brown versus the Video Software Dealers Association and Entertainment Software Association. When Schwarzenegger was governor of California, he wanted to fine the selling of violent video games to minors. This case was brought to the Supreme Court, but ultimately he lost this appeal. There were two amicus curiae, which is brief documents that translate directly to friend of the court. The Gruhl brief stated that researchers supported the idea that violent video games had an effect on cognition, affect, and behavior. This had 13 authors and 102 signees. The Millett brief, on the other hand, having 82 signees, stated that it didn't support the idea that violent video games had an effect. This was signed by industry representatives, owners, scholars, and medical scientists. The news media reported that it was a debate, depicting this point of contention as a 50-50 split. Denner, Pollard, Sachs et al. 2011 found that there was consensus that supported violent video games' effect. According to Wayne Warburton, there are established violent media effects, which includes mild aggression from just 10 to 15 minutes exposure. Longitudinal studies show these effects are cumulative, making individuals desensitized and more prone to the violence in real life. It can increase aggressive feelings, behaviors, and cognitions. It made individuals more fearful in overestimating the likelihood of being a victim, making individuals believe that the world is more violent than in reality. This is called the mean world syndrome. According to brain studies, emotional desensitization to violence brought about less concern or empathy relating to the suffering of others, and an increase in tolerating violence. Subtle long-term changes to thinking included increased normative beliefs that approve aggression, increased aggressive problem solving, hostile attributional bias, decreased empathy, and prosociality on a consistent basis. Anderson, Warburton et al. 2017 conducted the 7 Nations study, which found consistently that in 7 different countries where people used violent media, it had increases in aggressive cognitions and behaviors and decreased empathy. Keep note that no one risk factor brought about aggression, but rather it was an accumulation of these that increased the chances for aggression to occur. Risk factors for aggression included peer delinquency, media violence, peer victimization, neighborhood crime, gender, for example, being male, and abusive parenting. Anderson et al. Found that video game violence had a 0.3 longitudinal effect size, which was the same longitudinal effect size as gang members. TV had a 0.15 longitudinal effect, similar to having antisocial parents. And according to Anderson, Gentile, and Buckley in 2007, from their violent video game effects on children and adolescents. Research. John Murray et al. 2006 adapted from Roel Huysman's theory in 2000 to describe the process of reactions to TV violence. They proposed that it began first with observing violence, which led to the encoding of aggressive scripts, the rehearsal of these in imitation and fantasy, and an increase in accessibility of aggressive scripts. This led to aggressive reactions in the case of interpersonal conflicts, but little was known as to how these processes and violent imagery affect the brain, since experimentation would be needed, which would be difficult. According to the fMRI brain mapping study at the University of Texas, it was found that violent media reduced the involvement of the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is necessary for impulse control. There was increased activation in the limbic system and the amygdala, suggesting increased and automatic activation in fight or flight in response to a threat. There was increased activation in the posterior cingulate, which stores traumatic memories. Murray believed violence was stored there, and the pattern of activation was similar to that of PTSD patients, whereby these memories could be easily recalled. The right hemisphere was found to tend to process the negative information, processing about 80% compared to the left, and the right hemisphere was significant in the processing of negative emotions. Gentile et al. 2016 experimented with habitual players of violent versus non-violent video games and found that violent players turned the amygdala off, which turned off emotional processing and slowed down the ability to manage emotions. There was an active suppression in violent gamers. Overall, brain imaging found that violent media reduced prefrontal cortex activity, reduced inhibition control, and reduced executive function, such as attention to tasks. It activated centers of unconsidered action like fight or flight and desensitized individuals to the suffering of others. In terms of psychological acquisition, one must consider associative learning, which is the pairing of aggressive behavior with many cues. Also, researchers should consider operant conditioning, the rewarding of aggressive behaviors and not punishing it. There is also imitation, such as the fact that mirror neurons allow individuals to copy behaviors without thinking things through. This can allow individuals to copy aggressive characters if they deem them to be rewarding, attractive, etc., etc. Desensitization also needs to be considered, since those exposed to violent media become desensitized to aggressive impulses and become less empathetic. Ultimately, this leads to more aggressive scripts in the neural network. So how do we reduce violence and aggression by the media? Waite et al. In 1992 found that removing MTV in a maximum security forensic hospital significantly reduced aggression. Verbal aggression was reduced by 32.4%, and aggression against others was reduced by 47.5%. Violent media theories focus on how it activates emotion centers and reduces frontal lobe inhibition. Therefore, future researchers could think about how to change the neural networks of aggression through learning, how to change perceptions and the visual dominance of violence in media. They could research about whether certain personality types are more prone or vulnerable to violent media, and how do people use media to solve conflicts in their relationship, as in how do people model after characters in media. Thus, we need to conduct research, look for gaps in the literature, and for video game players, just take it in moderation and realize that it is just a game. It's not real life, though the brain itself may or may not make that distinction. Thanks for watching.